Hey everyone, thank you for joining. Thank you for studying this with us. We're excited to get into our next portion, which is Chayei Sarah, which is the life of Sarah. It's the first words in this portion, some of the first words in this portion. So we're going to go over these. You can see it there. It's Genesis 23 through 25, verse 12. And we're going to get into a little bit of a few things here today. The portion is kind of centered around the first line as far as the name. Now Sarah lived 127 years from Genesis 23 verse 1, and there's a lot of things in this portion that are really interesting. That is actually, if you guys want to go look at the life of Sarah, there's a lot of really interesting things in this verse where it talks about that, but that is not going to be our focus today. We're going to look at a little bit of an outline here. You'll see that I highlighted Genesis 24. That is where we're going to focus our attention for the most part today. Genesis 23, we start with the death and burial of Sarah, the mourning that Abraham has over Sarah. Then there's a focus that shifts to the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, or to the fact that they're trying to find a bride for Isaac. And that is where we're going to spend the most of our attention, even though there's a lot of really cool things in 25 with Abraham remarrying Keturah and the death of Abraham and Ishmael, some different things going on there. But that's not what we're going to focus on. We've got three main focuses that we're going to look at today, and it picks up in Genesis chapter 24, where it says, now Abraham was old, well advanced in years. So it kind of repeats itself there because it says he's old and then it says he's well advanced in years. We're going to look at that. And then the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. Verse 5 says, the servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to the land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord of the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. It's interesting, a part that we're not necessarily going to focus on in this portion too much, but something that I guess I hadn't really noticed in this story in the past as much as I noticed it this time, is that he is promising that the angel of the Lord will go before him. Now, we don't necessarily see that play out in the story, but by the way the story plays out, you can see the work of God going before Eliezer in this story. So we're going to focus on three things. The first thing we're going to focus on is this. It says in that first part of the verse, Abraham was old, he was well advanced in years, and the Lord blessed Abraham in all things. So why is it telling us twice that he's old here? Okay, it's an interesting piece that we are trying to get some clarity on. When I saw that word old, I looked it up in the Hebrew, and that word appears 40 times, and 40 and talking about the fact that Abraham is old seems to be putting together in the Hebrew that he has reached a point where he has completed his testing. So all of the things that he was asked to do by the Lord to prepare a people for the Lord, to be the one through whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed, all of these things that he had asked of Abraham, Abraham's completed. He's done his part up to this point. So now the question becomes, is that promise going to continue to the next generation? Because if you read through scriptures, there seems to be a lot of times where there's the Father and the Son, and then there's a drop off. There's the Father and there's a Son, and there's a drop off, or there's just a chosen person and then there's a drop off. We saw that a little bit with Noah, right? We see his kids being crazy. We saw it with Adam, with his two sons, and one of them is just not doing so hot. So there's all of these things that begin to take place. And so there is a focus now shifted to Isaac. Is this promise going to be passed on? And if it's going to be passed on, how is that going to take place? So I think there's a very important piece to the puzzle here where Abraham shifts his focus from living for the Lord in his own right, just obeying the Lord, walking with the Father, completing the assignments that he's been giving. And now it's shifting to the fact, can my son walk in these footsteps? So the Father now is sending a servant to ensure that that promise can extend to the next generation. Now, when we're reading, this is a very common interpretation tool, or something that we see in the different levels of biblical interpretation. When we are reading about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a lot of times what theologians will say is that there is a very clear picture of the Father, the Son, and then the Spirit of God taking the truth through the generations. So there's a very important thing for us to consider, and that is this. As we get to a place where our focus shifts from only being on our own walk to the walk of those coming after us, we have to ask ourselves this: am I passing the tests that the Father has brought me through? Am I seeing the value in those tests? Am I the one? Am I setting a good example for my son, my daughter, who's going to be coming after me, that trusting in the Father, trusting in his ways, trusting and walking in the truth, and being committed to that is going to produce a life that you can be content and satisfied with, and that they get to watch me go through those battles. They get to watch me go through those things. They get to watch, my wife and I, or our family, kind of go through the things that we're going through, and pass some tests that the Lord takes us through. The Bible says he takes us through those things because the testing of our faith develops patience. And when patience works its full course, we will be perfect, lacking nothing. So that's why these tests come. And that's something that we have to ask ourselves. And then the second thing is, are we doing things? Are we setting up our children, those coming behind us, the way Abraham set up Isaac and said, okay, we've got to find a way for this promise to connect to the next generation? Two really huge topics of conversation right there that you guys can discuss, and we will be discussing as we talk about this passage. All right, second focus. Now, here's where we get down to something very important, and that is we are trying to find a bride for Isaac. Remember, Abraham kind of messed this up. He had a bride. This was the promised bride. The Lord promised something. It's not happening. And so then he takes on a second bride who is Egyptian, not the lineage that the Father had selected for him, not the lineage that the Father had selected for his anointed one. That's what Mashiach, Messiah, means. That's what Christ means, is anointed one, the one that would come to show us the truth. He had a specific way he wanted to do this. And so now we have to focus on Isaac and say, okay, we have to have the right person for Isaac, for this blessing, this promise to pass down to the next generation. We've talked about this in every portion so far because it's really, really big, and you're going to see it again. Here again, we get into this idea from Genesis chapter 3 of the seed war. He needs this seed that Messiah will come through to go through a certain lineage so that it is uncorrupted. All right. That's really important because of what he wants to do later on. So we see that in Genesis 22:18. He's very particular about what's going to take place. Genesis 22:18. Give me 1 second. I've got it on this page over here. Genesis 22:18. It says that remember, it's that promise that through his offspring, or through his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, so that's the idea that he's trying to continue. So why not the Canaanites then? Well, that's a really interesting story, and you can go do some background, but I'll give you one perspective. Go study it for yourself, but here's one perspective. Canaan is a really interesting character that comes from the line of Noah. Now, if you remember, Noah had an interesting situation where he's drunk in his tent, and it says that Ham goes and uncovers his father's nakedness, right? That is an idiom in the Hebrew. Okay. And you'll see it when you get into Leviticus, you'll see it in Numbers, you'll see it in a lot of the commands where it says you're not supposed to do that. And it sounds kind of weird. Okay. What are we talking about? Just, pantsing them when, what are we talking about here? What does that mean to uncover your father's nakedness? It actually meant to sleep with his wife. Okay. That is what's being talked about here. And so what appears in that verse in Genesis 9, verses 20 through 27. If you want to look at some extra biblical material, it's in Jubilees 7. But there is this idea that Canaan was a result of a sin by Ham to sleep with Noah's wife and to come up with a child that he can take that blessing away from Abraham and away from the seed line that the father has chosen, and he could become the one in charge. He could become the one that is now the father of this new group of people that's forming, not Noah, not Shem, not the proper lineage that the father has ordained, but he wants to usurp that and take this away from him, just like the Lord promised in Genesis 3, that's what the enemy is going to continue to do. So he's working for the enemy. That's why that seed cannot come from Canaan. All right. And he says, go back to my homeland, to my father's house. Why? Because that's where the seed has been chosen to come from. Right. And he goes back to Abraham's brother's house, and chooses a wife who actually would have been Abraham's brother's granddaughter. And that is who he marries, which is Rebekah. Now, where else? Wow, I spelled else wrong. Where else do we see a father trying to find a worthy bride for his son? Okay, you can see these same pieces happening as you relate that to us being the bride of Messiah, right? He sends the Spirit of God. Eliezer is the servant that comes and is trusted with all these things. And Eliezer, his name literally means God is my helper. And he is trying to find a bride for Isaac. And what is he looking for? He's looking for several things that we find out through the text when he finds Rebekah. And we can relate those to the same things that the Father says he is looking for in the bride of Messiah. He finds someone who is holy and without blemish, someone who is making herself ready, someone who is pure, chaste, a virgin, someone who is a servant, and someone who is willing to be part of this union. There's some verses there for you, but that is what's happening here. Ephesians 5 is a very famous passage on husbands and wives. And as we're connecting this to Messiah, it even tells us in Ephesians 5 that the marriage is a picture of Christ and his church, or Christ and his bride. So if we're going to be in a union of marriage, we have to think about that in the same way. If I'm a husband, I have to think about taking care of my wife the way that the way that Christ would take care of his bride. And if I'm a bride, I should be thinking about how to be the type of bride that is worthy of Messiah, not just the man that I've chosen to spend my life with, right? So there's some interesting nuances there, but that's what's taking place here. We see kind of this same thing happening with even the birth of Messiah, right? You see all of these qualities in Mary, the mother of Messiah. Even when it says that he'd sent his angel ahead of Eliezer, right? And to prepare the way. He sent his angel ahead of Yeshua, right? There's lots of different parallels here we could talk about, but I'll leave that for you guys. All right. So again, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. If we are preparing ourselves to be united with Messiah, am I the kind of bride that my Messiah deserves? That's a question for me to come to terms with, right? And secondly, would I be as willing to respond to the invitation as Rebekah was, or would I judge that situation and find a way to turn it down, right? So that's our second focus. Finally, our third focus, and this is where I wanted to spend a little bit more time, is the servant Eliezer. Eliezer is a really important piece of the puzzle here, But let's look at Genesis 24. It says this: Then the servant is Eliezer, took 10 of his master's camels. Who else had 10 camels or more camels that came and magi on them to his birth? It was Messiah, right? Choice gifts, just like Messiah. He took all sorts of choice gifts. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Nahor is the name of Abraham's brother. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love or kindness there to my master Abraham. Let the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will also draw water for your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. So here we have this servant Eliezer. The first part of chapter 24, again, we're going to go back there. We want to notice something about this servant, that he is the servant of Abraham. He's the oldest one, the one that has been with Abraham the longest, okay? And that he had charge of everything that was Abraham's. That's going to come into play here in just a minute. But I want you to look at this servant a little closer. Let us look at him. Notice that he's been trusted for a very long time. It paints this picture once again of the Father sending his Spirit to guide the whole idea of what's happening with Messiah. But you're seeing this. So we see that prophetic picture there. We have a covenant promise. Again, that covenant promise is related to Messiah, because he's telling him you can't take a wife for Isaac from the Canaanites. It has to be from the seed that the Father has chosen. He's trusted by the Father, right? He's trusted by the Father with the Son. He's sent by the Father on a mission. There's 10 camels. That we could spend this entire portion on those 10 camels, because there's loads of significance in those 10 camels and what they represent. Those 10 commandments are the 10 words, because in creation, God says, it says in the Genesis account, God said 10 times. And then we have 10 commandments that line up with that. And then we have 10 tribes from Ephraim, which are related to the nations. We have all the different things that are related to the number 10. There's a lot we could unpack there, but suffice it to say this: there's a prophetic picture here that this bride that the servant is looking for is someone that the Father would approve of, someone who fits within the parameters of the covenant promises, and one who is obeying the commandments and worthy to receive choice gifts as a bride. So that's what we see packed into these different nuances of the bride that the servant is looking for. Okay. So I'm going to leave the rest of this portion for you guys to discuss. And I want to transition just a little bit to something that we see in the servant Eliezer that shows back up in the New Testament and is wildly misunderstood by a lot of Christians today, because we read it from a Western mindset, a Western perspective, and we miss what Paul is talking about when he uses a specific word. Okay, so the servant that shows up here, Paul is going to use a word in his writing to the Galatians that is pedagogos, okay, in the Greek. And it's a leader, an escort, a tutor, a schoolmaster. It's translated different ways, but we're going to find it here in Galatians chapter 3, and we're going to see a lot of different things, but I want you to see something significant. It says, before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Obviously, that faith would be Messiah. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, to lead us to Messiah, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. So this is where you'll get that famous school of thought where people say, see, Galatians says, have you read Galatians, right? It says we're no longer under the law. Well, let's go look up this idea of a tutor or a schoolmaster that the law is related to. Okay, so that word is pedagogos, and this is the definition you will get if you go look up this word in some biblical study sources. This was a guide and a guardian for boys. Among the Greeks and the Romans, the name that was applied to trustworthy slaves, trustworthy servants, okay, thank Eleazar, right? Who were charged with the duty of supervising the life and the morals of the boys belonging to the better class. Okay, so they were overseeing those boys and making sure those boys were raised the way the father wanted them to be raised, the way the parents wanted them to be raised. The boys were not allowed so much as to step out of the house without them before arriving at the age of manhood. So these boys could not leave the house without their Patagonia, if unless they reached the age of manhood. This Patagonia was there night and day, 365 days a year, didn't take holidays. This was a trusted servant, just like Eliezer. We see this in the story of Eliezer. So that's really important, because what the role of this Patagonia is this person was supposed to, he knew what the father wanted for the son. Okay. Just like Eliezer knew exactly what Abraham wanted for Isaac. And he was in charge of making sure that the son was raised knowing how to behave, what to say, how to act, that the son married the right person, all of these different things. That person was there to help guide the son until the son had fully adopted the ways of the father and no longer needed the tutor. Okay, so think about that in this context. Okay, so when we are no longer under a tutor, okay, or under the law, it's because we have now matured enough to follow the ways of the tutor without the tutor. Or let me rephrase that: the ways of the father without the tutor. That's the idea. The idea is, once you've reached that place of maturity where you no longer need the law because the law is written on your heart, then you are no longer under the tutor. You are under faith, because you know what the law says. And because of the life of Messiah in us, now we want to obey the law. So it's not that the law is irrelevant. It's that the law was keeping us in a very real way, the same way we give very specific instructions to our children that may be a little bit black and white, because they don't understand gray areas yet. He did the same thing for us with the law. Here is the black and white. This is right. This is wrong. This is sin. This is righteousness. This is good. This is bad. So that we could see very clearly what it is. And now the Spirit of God, the servant of God, the trusted servant, the Eleazar, the Lord is my help, right? Now comes and leads us in a way where we can follow the law without having to be under the curse of the law, under the law in a way that they were under the law, because we now see the fuller picture through Messiah. I hope that makes sense. If not, text me and we'll talk more about it. All right. Romans 8, we're going to finish with this. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. See, right there, we're set free from the law, right? That's not what it says. It says you're set free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, because we were trying to do it in our own strength, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. See, all that sounds like, we don't need the law anymore, right? Well, keep reading. Verse 5, for those who are according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who are according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. Because the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. and those who are in the flesh cannot please God. So listen to that very carefully. It says, the one who puts their mind on the flesh is hostile towards God because it does not submit itself to the law of God. And that because of that, we can't please God. What is the flip of that? Then someone whose mind is on the Spirit, that's the Spirit of God in us is seeking to do the deeds of the law, the works of the law, not for salvation purposes, obviously, but because that's what God desires of us. And therefore, we are not hostile towards God anymore. We are in line, in step with God, and we can therefore be pleasing to God because we are walking in the Spirit, which has our minds set on the fulfilling the law. So there we go. Just one more piece for you there that shows up in the life of Eliezer. God bless you. Shabbat Shalom. Love you guys, and we'll see you next time.